says, so let's not worry about it. It's great to be here again. I'm Steve Costello. I'm a psychologist and also a coach, and I use mindfulness to guide my practice, which is interesting. I'm not a mindfulness teacher, and my co-presenter today is Leo Farberg. Hi, Leo. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you, Steve.
Would you like to tell the watchers and listeners a little bit about Leo? What do you do? Where do you work?
I'm a psychologist and a therapist. I work in private practice about 23 years already. Um, I live in quite a small place. That's why I don't have any special topic on counseling. Just everybody who needs help can come, and that made my practice very wide from like child psychology and parenting and perinatal, that's about pregnancy and giving birth, and uh, trauma, stress related issues, family therapy. So I've got it all over the place, and they can answer so many questions that probably I have to shut up and let you ask questions before I start speaking.
Brilliant. Thanks, Leo. Yeah, I relate to that. so, so I know exactly where you're coming from. Um, let you ask questions was your last couple of words. So I'm just going to mention something that I talked about frequently last week. I talked about asking questions because there's no such thing as a bad question. Well, there is such a thing as a bad question if you didn't bother to ask a question. So please, everybody out there, if you've got a question, please ask it. Get it in the chat, get it to Steve Beer, our producer, wherever you need to get this question, get it out there. We'll put up some contact details on the screen in a little while as well. So if you want to contact us by email, by Facebook, by Telegram, by WhatsApp, whatever, you can send us messages there too. We will always accept your messages, and we can guarantee that you will get a reply. So please, if you've got a question, don't fail to ask. But it's important. So here's a question. How can we deal with loss? Last week we talked about grief and loss. We didn't talk about only about grief and loss relating to bereavement and death, but we talked about the loss of a job, for example, or the loss of a partner and the grieving processes that go with that. We're not going to go into the grieving processes much today, although they probably will be mentioned. But how can we deal with loss? So I just want to hold that question for a moment and ask another. Is the loss of a job similar to the loss of a loved one? They don't sound the same, but what do you think, Leo? Leo, did you hear me?
Can you please repeat the question? Is the loss of a job similar to?
The loss of a loved one. They don't sound the same. However, what do you think?
Well, to my knowledge and my experience, loss is practically similar all the way from losing a loved one, losing a job, losing a thing, losing a place, moving from one place to another, for example. It's probably not exactly the same, but very close, because basically we experience loss and a whole spectrum of emotion about losing something or somebody. Uh, be, Practically because of that bonding that was created throughout the experience of mm, being in touch with this thing or person or pet, or this for example a job, something you do, because it becomes part of your life. It becomes somewhat you build an attachment to, and when you lose something, uh, so that means that uh, this attachment is broken now, and uh, if it's lost forever, like through death, or if you're fired, because it's kind of a bit different, but basically on the neuro brain level, it's practically the same, because you have some basic mm, things you do, place you go, and then it's stopped and broken, but the mind still keeps the this well, these actions or and emotions toward the place, for example, or the job. And by the way, the job is also very important, because not just because you it provided for you, there adds a kind of uh, anxiety about what's next, because our mind doesn't like anything new, frankly speaking. It likes to be stable and repetitive and controlled. That's why as soon as there is something you don't know, it starts bringing up the anxiety, because of the lack of knowledge, or lack of being sure. That's probably it's also common, because when you lose someone, there is also a question: how will I live without this person, or without thing, or without your pet?
Brilliant, thank you. That just brought to mind something from, so I said this last week. I'd been talking to somebody who had suffered a loss through death. And this person said, I don't know how I will manage, because clearly the person who passed away was somebody she relied upon, she knew she could go to in certain circumstances. There was a lot of support there. And she said, I don't know how I'll manage. And that's not surprising, because her world had changed suddenly. An essential part of her support mechanism, as she put it, so this is a very English thing, had gone west. And what she meant by gone west is that it had disappeared and wasn't her anymore, which was quite interesting. But it's worth bearing in mind. Now, I was thinking about grief in terms of emotions. Grief is a natural emotion. It's not something that we should be fearful of. It's not something, although we will come on to fear in a little while, it's not something we should run from. But from a positive psychology point of view, which is where I come from, or at least where I choose to come from, grief is a natural emotion, and it doesn't mean that we're broken. Grief doesn't may make us feel as though we're broken, but in actual fact, no, we're not. There's nothing wrong with grieving. Grieving is acceptable. Grieving is something that we have to allow to take place. But sometimes it's not surprising, as Leo just said, that given a relationship we had, there are times when we feel a lack of logic, how to make sense of it all. And that in itself brings other challenges. And it becomes almost like a circle, a never-ending circle. We're running around this circle trying to find the logic. So we start to feel things like sadness, anger, loneliness, hopelessness, because these are common emotions associated with grief and loss. It's not unusual. So here's one for you, Leo, because we couldn't connect last week. Somebody asked, how long does grief last?
It depends, really. There is no any particular time span. The general idea is that it depends on how deeply, how intrinsically you were attached to this person, thing, or maybe an animal, because the main idea is that you have to. I completely agree what Steve, you just said about the fact that grief is a natural emotion. It's not just anger or sadness. It's a separate, I mean, a distinct emotion, which is very important for human and also non-human creatures. Some animals experience grief too, and it's of course, there are some concerning the length of the period of grief. There are some more or less discussed spans of time, for example, like it should be a year or 2 years, or in difficult or very emotionally intrinsic cases like a loss of a child or loss of a loved one, someone who is very, very dear and close to you, it may last much longer. And there are also some clinical criteria for prolonged grief or complicated grief. But basically, it's not that a year passes and you just cleared out. No, it's a non-linear process when in some periods of time you feel, very intense emotion, then there is then comes a short period of time, or maybe a longer period of time when something feels quite all right, and then suddenly you see something, or what is associated with someone you lost, and the feelings may come up as if anew. That makes the your grief very, very attached to the type of loss you had.
Wonderful, thank you. And just following on, so picking out from what Leo's just been talking about, there isn't a set schedule. There just isn't. We can't say it's going to last for a month, 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, or whatever. And for some people, after 12 months, the grieving process of 12 months, it may feel like yesterday. It may feel that what happened was just yesterday. But for others, 12 months might seem like a lifetime ago. We're all different. I'm going to relate back once more, and I'm not going to apologize for this, but I'm going to relate back once more to positive psychology. So nobody's broken because it takes you 12 months, or because you're suffering severe grieving feelings and symptoms. It doesn't make you any weaker than somebody who deals with it in a month or 2 weeks. That's not what it's about. So what we need to do is find out what your strengths are, and let's look at your strengths and work on those. Because through the strengths, we can find ways of dealing with the grieving process. Now, we're not going to do that here today, but one of the things that Leo and I do is group coaching, what we call group coaching. It may involve some coaching, it may involve some therapy, but it works with people who have similar challenges. We're not going to put a brush over everybody and say we're all the same, because that's not the case. But we work with people who have similar challenges, and we work in small groups. And through those groups, we'll look at the theory, we'll look at the practice, and we'll look at how we can manage whatever it is that's happening in our lives. What sort of tools might we use? And I will be sharing one later. I don't know whether Leo's got one. I was going to drop that on him at the very end and see what happens, because I like that just for fun, of course, and he knows that. But there are things we can do through group coaching. So if you're interested, contact us and we'll tell you more about it. We can't really do that here and now. One of the things that's worth thinking about, and arguably this comes from psychology, it comes from mindfulness, absolutely, definitely, and it comes from a lot of writers over the last few years. And my favorite writer of all on this subject, that I've not even introduced yet, is a chap called Dr. Wayne Dyer. Wayne Dyer passed away a few years ago from leukemia, but he had some wonderful things to say about how we think, how we look at things. And by things, he means how we look at grief, how we look at an event that's happened in our life that has caused various emotions. So there's a whole host of things that come under things. So quite literally, if you study neuroscience, you'll see that words can change your brain. So in other words, what I'm thinking up here, if I keep thinking I'm a bad person, I'm a bad person, I'm a bad person, eventually my brain's going to start believing that, and the bad person I will be. Now, that's perhaps an extreme example, but it's just to give you a flavor of what I'm talking about. So, the words we speak to ourselves via that inner voice, we're all familiar with that inner voice, right? Or our inner critic, can play a very large part in all aspects of our lives. So, the things we say can affect many, many things, and they can definitely affect grief. I just want to give you an example of when I was between 11 and 12 years old. I can't remember exactly, around about that age. So we had woodwork lessons at school. The woodwork teacher was a very cool guy, and I thought he was great. And then one day we were making something really simple out of wood, and he looked at my efforts and said, "You've made a pig's ear of that, boy." And what he meant was that wasn't very good. What I'd made was, it wasn't right. The measurements were wrong. And I don't know why, but that's the way it was. And what happened from that day forward is that I started to tell myself that I was not good at woodwork. And I told myself that frequently. Every time we went to a woodwork lesson, I couldn't quite get it right. I'm not very good at this. I'm not very good at this. I'm not very good at this. Until 3 years later, when I had an option to choose woodwork or not, I decided, no, I'm not going to choose woodwork. I'm not good at it. Why bother? Life went on. I carried on believing well into my adulthood that woodwork was just not one of my superpowers. Until one day I needed to make something. And I was determined to make this thing. It was a thing for the house. And I got on with it and I made it. And I was proud of it. And it looked good and it worked. And it's actually a very big wardrobe at the end of a room in the house where I live today. So the thing that I wasn't good at woodwork was disproved. And now I feel much more comfortable. I'm not a fantastic carpenter. I'm never going to be a master carpenter, but I'm not bad at woodwork. You get the point. So
That's a great story, Steve.
Thank you. But how does that relate to grief and loss? So how did I relate that? How did I? It's about the way we think. And thinking is based on our experiences, my experience in woodwork, for example. So relating to grief and loss. Leo, would you like to give your view on that?
We are probably the only creature on earth who really know that we are to face grief and loss on our life. Even if you manage to pass your childhood without losing a grandparent or a neighbor or somebody, anyway, on the way of your life, the older you get, the more losses you face. And that's why grief is really what we mentioned before, is a natural emotion. It has to be we have to be mindful about it. We are aware about it. That's why no matter how painful it feels, we really don't want to lose it from our sight. Not to fear it, but be kind of aware and ready. And concerning the neuroplasticity, I mean, this is the notion of our brain being able to change itself, change and create new neural pathways. It's also kind of rebuilding the neural network about our representation of the person in our brain, our mind. Uh, Sometimes guilt is real. Grief is related to, as like a mindful absence, like as if there should be somebody or something, but there is none, and as if we go through our life without knowing that there is a spare space now. And the process of grief is kind of mending, healing this as if it was a wound, but it may get scarred depending on how important your loss is. But still, we can bear in mind that we don't have to carry it constantly open and bleeding, you know, because some people are afraid that if they stop grieving, that means they forget the person they lost. But basically, you cannot forget anything. You just gi- give it a place, like, you know, b- like growing a flower in the place of loss,
Yeah.
and it's not
Here's
empty
a
anyway.
here's an interesting thought. So one of my grandparents, grandmother in particular, she was very fond of a bird called a robin. Anybody listening in today from the UK knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's a beautiful little bird, brown, light brown with a red breast. And that was my nan's very favorite bird in the whole world. She loved wildlife anyway, but that was her one. So now, every time I hear or see a robin, what happens? I'm reminded every time. And it's wonderful and it's positive and it feels nice. You know, so we've all got that ability, not like Leo said, we don't forget. It's all there somewhere. It's all part of our experience. You know, we don't forget things.
I can share my story about, you know, when the grief is not attended well enough, especially in children. I was 6 years old when my grandfather passed away. uh, and I loved him very much. He was part of my upbringing, very, very close relationship to him. But as well, and it's still not accepted. There are still now widely spread knowledge about how to help children to get through grief. Though you can find a lot of things now on the internet, but like 42 years ago, you couldn't find this information. And while grown-ups were busy living through their grief, which was kind of, I remember my grandmother grieving very long and very hard. Uh, I thought, I thought nothing. I mean, I was 6 years old. There was my grandfather, and there wasn't my. Then there comes a time there isn't my grandfather. But when I was learning therapy, and of course we're working on our own issues through some exercise which was not concerning grief at all, but through the like working with associations and the senses and feelings and ideas that come through doing some exercise. I strangely came to the idea of sadness, loss, and then I had an association with my grandfather, uh, whom I had lost like when I was 6, and I was very surprised and kind of relieved because I thought of him once in a while. I told people stories how I was attached to my grandfather, but suddenly I found that like grain of grief in myself, and I treat it like a treasure, you know. It's important because it's something left, not just the memories about him, but also that little grain that I finally grieved him mindfully, not just living with after the loss.
Yeah, brilliant. Love that story. That's great. So I told a similar, not the same story, but a similar story last week about my own dad grieving his dad, and the smell of
Mm,
pipe tobacco was the thing that triggered his grief some months after my granddad passed. You know, so that's quite interesting. And we got into the idea of our olfactory or smell memory creates all kinds of things in our long-term memories. You know, it remembers all sorts of stuff. And I think for me, even today, if I smell that particular pipe tobacco, I think of my granddad every time. You know, which is a bit like the robin. You know, a different thing, but similar
mhm.
idea. But so it never goes away. It's nice. So, what about optimism and pessimism? So I was thinking about this the other day when I was talking to after I'd been talking to a client. Um, because if you have an optimistic nature or a pessimistic nature, that definitely plays a part in the grieving process. So if we're optimistic, they're in a better place. Somebody said after my mum passed, she's not in pain any longer. She's in a better place. The pain's gone. So that was a very optimistic view. Pessimistic view was my younger brother. I don't know what I'll do, not being able to speak to her again. There's nothing to do. I can't do anything about it. It's not something positive. I don't know how to deal with it. So you've got two sides relating to the same death, obviously two different people. So optimism and pessimism clearly plays a part in the grieving process. Grieving about losing a job, for example. I know I'm jumping from the death of somebody now to losing a job. You're grieving about losing a job. Will I be able to get another job? I'll never get another job as good as the one I just lost. Who's going to want to employ me now? I've just lost a job. It may not have been your fault, but those are some genuine feelings that go with it. Who wants me? Why should anybody want to employ me? Whereas the pessimistic approach is perhaps something like, hey, that was a gift. Now I've got an opportunity. Now I've got an opportunity to do that new thing that I've always been talking about, or to look for a better job than the last one, something that fits my little box a little bit better than the previous one did. So optimism and pessimism clearly play a part. Leo, do you want to add anything to that? Because if you don't, I'll keep talking.
I just thought, while you were talking, I thought an idea came to me that while grieving about somebody, it's like we attach this emotion to the person, but grieving and feeling pain are kind of, you can separate that, because pain is always about yourself. You can attach it to the person, or to losing a job, losing some stability. Basically, another idea probably we should discuss is that right now the whole world is grieving because of losing stability and not having time to grieve, and it's building up. But when the pain is about you, and all the time, because the dead are not in pain anymore. And understanding that it's you experiencing pain like a physical pain, and basically if you experience grief, you can relate to the level of pain being basically physical, that you can and should take care of your pain as if you were sick or like broken arm. It's the psyche has the same mechanism about wounding and healing, breaking up and getting together, might be in a different way, but still the natural way of things is healing, is making up, not making it the way it was, but still making up in some other way, assembling itself, making it whole. That's why we're all more and more talking about wholeness, holistic healing. And pain is something you definitely can deal with, and take care of, and should.
Yeah, I think I've got my own story to tell about pain. It's not perhaps not appropriate for today, but a simple accident led to grief and loss, because I lost my job because of the accident, and the pain that went with all of that, the physical pain I'm talking about, was off the scales. Doctors used to say to me, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad's your pain today, Steve? And I would say 15 or 20 or whatever, because it really was off the scale. And not managing it, because it took a long time to begin to manage it. That was bad English. It took a long time to begin to manage it, meant that the grieving process couldn't finish. It just kept going and going and going. So I had to manage the pain, which I did eventually. And it got better, and it became easier, and the grief became a thing of the past, and I became an entrepreneur. There you go. The rest is history. Anyway, we've not had any questions so far today, but please, everybody, remember, if you have a question, ask the question. If you ask a big earth-shattering question, brilliant, we love it. We may not answer it completely today, but we will answer it next week. So we'll make something of it, but you will get answers to your questions. So if you've got a question, please do ask. So one of the things we've kind of been skirting around or floating around is the idea of values and beliefs, because they too can affect the grieving process in quite a big way. And of course, our values and beliefs also play a part in our own grieving and loss. So the value, for example, of or a belief, I should say, the belief that there is a God and that when we all die we go to heaven, or we rise again on the last day, or whatever you want to believe. If you've got a strong belief like that, that can be helpful in the grieving process. They've gone to a better place. They're moving on. This is what is supposed to happen. It's the circle of life, whatever you want to call it. So that can be a positive experience from that point of view. But what about somebody who believes in nothing? When we're gone, we're gone. Is that harder to manage? Is it harder to grieve, or do you grieve more because you don't really know where your loved one went, where they disappeared to? That's getting quite philosophical in some ways, but what do you think, Leo?
I don't really have any data, if there is any special data. Maybe there is how not having any beliefs about the afterlife affect the grieving. I guess it's really hard, and in losses, especially losses that that are very difficult to process, they anyway raise the question of spiritual believing or spiritual ideas, because they are always connected, the afterlife and spiritual realm. And many people who might be very faithful before might rethink their ideas about God and church and believing anything. Those who have been atheists or didn't just thought that life ends and that's all, they also raise the question. They do talk about it. And probably it's also the moment of instability where you can really reevaluate your values, if I may say so. I was raised as an atheist, but throughout my life, so many things happened, and later so much information came in that I chose chose consciously what I am like, what I choose to believe in. As soon as you are stable in your ideas, it's easier to attach them to the process you're going through.
Yeah, I was thinking about culture also, culture and belief system that comes from culture. So there are some cultures I can think of in the UK that follow, for example, let's think about the Muslim faith, the Muslim way. So they believe that they go to heaven and so on, very much like Christians believe that they go to heaven, and in heaven there is a God and they walk with God. And that's something they believe very strongly, which is fantastic. That helps in all kinds of ways as well. So it's a very positive thing. But I found in my early years, part of my culture was Roman Catholic, and it was, you shall go to church. And my little brain was saying, but why, but why, but why? And I didn't really get a great explanation. It was something that we had to do, because if we didn't do it, we were turning against God, and that was hurtful and could lead to all kinds of things. Nuns in school told me that I would go to hell one time. I didn't do something particularly bad, but that's what they used to say. They used to say it to put, quote, the fear of God into us, because God-fearing was a thing at that particular time. So my culture played a part in my life, and what it did make me do was turn away from that culture, that part of my community, my culture. I didn't want to be a part of that. So that also affects things. There was a grieving process in that as well, because my mother was very unhappy with the fact that I walked away from the Catholic Church. So you kind of grieving, she was kind of grieving on my behalf, and she prayed for me, and she was worried about me. Several people prayed for me that I'm aware of, and is all that part of the grieving process? That's something worth thinking a bit about. So what about our emotions as well? So let's think about it like this. Our emotions come from our thoughts. There's not a little button that says I want the emotion of joy or sadness or whatever. They come from the way I'm thinking. So two people in exactly the same situation, as I mentioned earlier with my brother in particular, my younger brother, two people in the same situation feel different emotions because they have different thoughts on the whole situation. So what can we do with that? Can we use that, do you think, Leo?
I think emotions are a more complicated issue, and it really depends on the personality and the experience and the type of attachment a person had to someone or something lost. Again, the spiritual values, it all depends, and it's very unique to every person. And even concerning one and the same loss, different people involved in the same situation do grieve differently. Like the parents who lost the same child grieve in a different pace, different manner, uh, and they both grieve, but they are not never synchronized. That may bring a lot of problems within the couple, for example, because everyone is looking at each other and think you grieve it wrong, and that brings an issue of up to breaking up. So mm, we cannot. It's probably not even useful to compare,
Yeah.
but it's very useful to discuss. It's very useful to be open about it with the people who are concerned, or just your close friends or someone, anybody who you are close to. And the provide, but I think the main person you have to be open up, it's yourself. You have to be open to yourself, not trying to conceal things or try to not notice or whatever. You have to accept grief. I mean, being open up to accept, if I can say so.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, brilliant. There is a question in from Philip who asks, can grief change you?
Definitely.
Definitely. I've got a lot of positive examples floating around in my head right now. But I suppose it can work. If it can be positive, it can work the other way as well, because as I've been saying, this whole idea of thinking, the way we think about things, what we think about can change a lot of things. So grief can change you if you look upon it as, well, actually it's positive because that person is now in a better place. I'm sorry to keep using that example, but it's short and sweet. So if that person is in a better place, my grief feels a little bit better. It feels a little bit lighter, perhaps. I feel a little bit joyful. I might be able to reflect on the person's life. I've been reflecting on my mum's life just recently, which is a natural thing to do. And I've been reflecting on some highly amusing stuff as well. That some of it I can share, some of it I won't. But it's very funny, So that's all positive. So grief can change you. It can lighten your mood. It can make you feel better about things. It can bring things together. It can perhaps even help you to reassess the way you been living your life through the lessons that you learned from the person who passed away. So, from that point of view, grief can change you.
I think,
So, what?
can I? I would say just count on grief to change you. It's probably something wrong if it doesn't change you, because
Yeah,
it's a process that makes you feel things differently, and it's growing. It makes you more mature. It probably the many losses you uh, experience, the more strength you get, probably. But you have to really be uh, emerged. I mean, not uh, conquered by grief, but uh, letting yourself uh, mindfully go through it. And that's the great way to evolve.
yeah, brilliant. Another question: how can I cope with my loss? The loss, in particular, being somebody's wife called Tina. I don't know where that came from exactly, but how can I cope with my loss? I mentioned at the very beginning of today's show that there are some practical things we can do. There are some exercises I'm going to share one before we finish today, um, that help just to clarify things in your mind, to in some ways lighten the load and keep you grounded and centered. Because as mindfulness tells us, everything that happens right here, right now, in this moment. It's happened, yes, stuff that's happened yesterday was yesterday. This moment matters most. So the things that help us get into the moment. Being in the moment helps us cope with a great many things, a great many challenges. So that's something we can consider in a moment. Um, what do you think, Leo? What can we do to cope with loss? What practical things can we try?
Well, as I said, I mean, very practical. I can share some tools. It's just they're just tools. I mean, really the tools. You know, make conscious space for grieving. I mean, in time, because we are dealing with a broken attachment with the associations. For example, you come home, you open the door, and she's not there, and it breaks your heart. Literally breaks your heart. But uh, it's uh, it's exactly what has to happen so that you can retrain your brain. It's like getting used to accepting the fact that she's not here. That's why one thing, if it's something comes unexpectedly, for example, like you enter the kitchen and she should be there but she's not there, and it suddenly becomes conscious, and probably you feel at least upset, or you start crying or something, let yourself do it, because as soon as it come to your consciousness, the uh, acceptance or the knowledge that she's not here, and it makes you sad, it brings pain, you cry, you do something to pass through it. If like you pick up the phone and think that I'll call her and ask her whether I should buy like potatoes or not. And then you realize that no one would answer and you cry. And that's and just let it be that way, just in case you find it unacceptable to cry like in front of many people. Just okay, take it with you, take it, go somewhere, uh, but then let yourself go through the feelings. It's not necessarily crying, but it's always crying. So like also you can make it a planned mm, action. For example, you wake up in the morning and you take some time, like from 5 minutes to like 30 minutes, and take a time to sit there and cry, or maybe just feel sad, or like you can use something to even to kind of warm the emotion up and make it stronger, though it might feel uh, uncomfortable, but at the same time it's something you control. You make them stronger. You can take the pictures, you can take the clothes, you can cry over them, and then this some part of emotion uh, goes out. You go back to the everyday things, at the same time remembering to grieve very small things. Like if you turn on the TV and you see a commercial where a happy family is, like, going to a trip, and you think that you never go for a trip with your wife anymore, then sit and cry and think about it and let this emotion go through you. And as long as it takes, just let it. And then, as if, like you learn, like uh, carpenting, like Steve said, you do it not very good at first. It's like training a new, mm, like action, and you do it bad, and then third time is bad, and the 50th time is bad, but then it gets better and better. And same with these little things, when you bring up, when it pops up into your mind that she's not here, and time after time, and you will get better, and it won't be that intense, and won't be that frequent, and it will add some like silver lining to it. But that was a great trip we had like 5 years ago,
Yeah,
and finally it gets into its place.
brilliant. I think for me, one of the main things that kept coming at me out of what you've just been saying, Leo, is that there is no weakness. There is no weakness in grief, none whatsoever. It's in if anything, there's strength. Being allowing yourself and being able to grieve. Okay, we only have about 10 minutes left. I've just noticed that somebody said that I lost my mum a few days ago. I can't get rid of her clothes. My personal view on that, because I lost my mum less than 4 weeks ago, is so not yet. Don't get rid of them. If
I can
somebody
add
has, sorry,
I can add this the same. I agree that don't. But when,
yeah,
as on the process, when you think of getting rid of her clothes, uh, then take every cloth, or every like thing you see, and cry over it, and just
yeah,
like letting go of in portions, leaving the most precious items to yourself. Choose something that will be here with you for a long time, just maybe one or two or three things that are associated closely, not just because they're expensive or old, but the most emotional things. It might be a little shawl, but not a fancy item from her cupboard, but that's something that you can hold on and think of her deeply and emotionally. That's the way of getting rid of clothes.
yeah, brilliant. So just a reminder, traditionally, Leo and I work with single clients. So for me, they can be coaching clients, or they can be psychotherapy clients, therapy clients, counseling clients, whatever you like to call it. But also, we've found there's a lot of value in working together with groups of people with similar challenges come together. We lead the process, we enable certain discussions and so on to take place. We inject some learning and some exercises. And of course, we use the experience of the people in the group. And the people in the group benefit from one another. It's a win-win situation. It's fantastic. So that is one of the things we do. So if you'd like to know more about that, then leave us a message. The contact details are around. You will be able to see them, and we will get back to you. We can have a chat about it. So here's something to think about, something that struck a big chord with me just recently. And it's from a very famous novel called Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky wrote, amongst other things, the darker the night, the brighter the stars. So what did he mean by that? Well, I can't go and ask the guy who's no longer around, but what I took from that personally, grieving, you could look upon that as quite as a dark night. When you lose somebody or something, the night goes dark. But there's always a bright star in the sky, a bright star that reminds you of something beautiful, something wonderful, a bright star that reminds you how you got your second degree because of that place that just let you go. You know, you got a new academic degree from that workplace, or there's all kinds of bright stars in the sky. And I think thinking about those bright stars definitely helps with the grieving process. So think about it like that. What bright stars can you see out there? I've got one with my mum. And she said to me not very long ago, less than 10 years, you're never too old to get a thick ear. A thick ear is smack on the side of the head for being cheeky. And that she said to me, like I said, less than 10 years ago. It was very funny. And it's still there. I can hear her voice saying that to me. So that's one of my bright stars, because I was being cheeky with her at the time and she was being cheeky with me, and it was good. It's what we positive banter. So think about that. The darker the night, the brighter the stars. Just think about those positive, bright stars. And if we can train our minds to look for the positives, our minds begin to do so naturally after a time. Yes, things come up. Yes, sometimes we think about the dark stuff. But still, we think the positives. We'll find the positives. We're more likely to find them if we can find ways to think them. So what are the happy memories? Now, I'm really acutely aware of two things. First of all, I said I was going to share an exercise, so I'm going to try and do that in a minute, but I'm a little bit worried about time. And we've not mentioned fear. Not really. Both Leo and I'm aware, have used the word fear today, but we've not really said what we mean by it. And I think it deserves some acknowledgement, because grief and loss often feel like fear. As I said earlier, I've lost a job. Oh my, will somebody else take me? You begin to fear the idea that somebody might not want you anymore. How will I manage? Somebody died. How will I cope? Oh my word, how will I manage? And this fear emotion begins to develop and grow. So how can we manage fear? Would you like to speak on that for a minute, Leo? But you're going to be limited.
Well, I think fear, it's something we might discuss some other time in a deeper way, because it's important. People do pendulate between fear and high emotions, and it's a whole spectrum where you go. I just want to say that, yes, fear is something to be accepted as well, because it's also natural, but it's still it's not just trying to suppress it, but to ask you, what are you ask yourself, because when Steve talks about bright stars in the dark of the night, I could say that another star is you. I really do believe that all these difficult emotions are something that kind of let yourself crystallize through them. When you live through them, you know more and more about yourself, and you make like a star, a crystal, or something bright. And the same is with fear. You just ask yourself, what are you fearful of? And probably there will come an answer, and then you can discuss it with yourself, and you can discuss it in a group, because you can, concerning other types of help, it's not Steve and I can provide a lot of help. Bereavement groups, grief counselors. Just don't stay alone, because sometimes the sparkle is seen in the eye of the beholder when you think that everything is too dark.
Yeah. Beautiful. Now, we really don't have time for the exercise, I promise. So if you look at the screen right now, the bottom of the screen, there's a facebook.com/Steve P. Costello. That'll take you to one of the business pages that Leo and I use. And what I will do is I'll record this exercise, or I'll do it live on the page on Facebook. So anybody who wants to see it will be able to take a look. It's a really useful exercise for grounding yourself and for allowing yourself to look at these things that challenge and hurt us and to let them float away just for a few minutes. We're not ignoring them. We're not putting them under a rock and hoping they'll never resurface, but it's just to enable us to center ourselves, to relax a little bit and let some of these things just drift away for just for a few minutes. It's a feel-good thing. It works. It's evidence-based. All the tools that Leo and I use are evidence-based, so you can be sure that somebody somewhere has researched them. So that's facebook.com/Steve P. Costello. And you'll find that page and you'll see the latest video. I'm going to record it as soon as we're done here. Okay. Leo, anything to add at the end of this?
I'm just glad we're having this conversation because not many people, even psychologists, are ready to discuss grief because it hurts. And you really have to work it through by yourself to be able to help people and to let them the pain out. It's true. Not many psychologists and not many people and not all of the clergy can bear the pain of a loss from somebody. That's why people prefer to shut it down. But really, the way is to get through. That's why I'm really glad we raised this topic, though it's quite probably might seem hard and scary.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So remember, please, everybody, if you have questions, use one of the contact methods. Ask your questions. We will respond. If we get a really great, big question, fantastic. That gives us the question for next week's show, because we will be back here next week and every week at 1 p.m. in the UK, 2 p.m. in Central Europe, whatever p.m., wherever you are, or maybe a.m. we're here, we're live, or you can catch us recorded if you can't make the live show. Leo, final word.
See you next week. We'll be here.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Take care. We'll speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye.